every single time I read George MacDonald, it doesn't even matter what the genre is, I'm always just blown away. I can't believe it. So it's a cheap answer perhaps to give, but it's the only really trustworthy one, genuine one I can give, is that there really is no aspect of my theology that hasn't been influenced. And it really is, though, I think, traceable back to just Christ himself, that it's the Father of Jesus Christ is totally good. But really the only other way I can sum it up is 1 John 1. This is what we have heard and pass on to you, that God is light, and in him there is no darkness at all. I have to say, it was not until I read MacDonald that I first not only understood what that could possibly mean, but believed it.
I'm just so thrilled to have Chris Green and Jordan Wood joining us for our conversation of the themes in theology in the novel Lilith by George MacDonald. And before we jump into the specifics of the book itself, and really just a few excerpts, because we could spend an entire 2 semesters probably just in that book, I thought I'd ask Jordan and Chris to share a little bit of their own journey. And so this is for both of you, starting with Chris. Could you share a bit of your spiritual journey, and what was your church and community context of your childhood and youth, and what does your participation in church and community look like today?
Yeah, so I was raised in a rural, independent Pentecostal church. I was a part of what they called the Free Holiness Movement. And free meaning free church, independent of any kind of ecclesial order whatsoever, which simply meant that the ecclesial order was hidden from us. Not that there was still a strict hierarchy. It's just no one knew to name it as such. And holiness being an emphasis on moral codes, dress codes in particular, intensely Pentecostal. I often talk about it as sweaty Pentecostalism. We went to church all the time for hours at a time, 4 times a week, every week, and very often more than 4 times a week, for hours every time. And you put your life at hazard to go to church. It was intense, unbelievably intense. When I went off to Bible school, I was shocked at how unintense, how lax all other churches were. It's something short of a cult, but it was very sectarian. So I don't think it's fair to say it was even culty, but it was very sectarian. And so we didn't attend other churches. And when I went to Bible school, and I'm 17 years old, my first real experiences in other churches were shocking. like I didn't feel existentially threatened simply by being there. I didn't know what to do with myself. And I know we'll get to how I encountered MacDonald, but it was at that Bible school that I read MacDonald, and that changed everything for me. And today, I'm a bishop in the Continuing Anglican Movement, right? So there's a sermon of me. I'm 9 years old preaching, and in the sermon, which it's like a 40-minute sermon, right? And I'm preaching about the dangers of reading any Bible other than the King James Version. At one point in the sermon, I give a list of sins that are comparable to reading the NIV or any other, which, by the way, at that point in my life is the only other translation I knew. I'm talking like there are all these various translations, but the only one in my mind that I could name was the NIV. And so I say, if you're going to read any version other than the King James, you might as well smoke 100 cigarettes a day, which is a lot of smoking, and or kill someone every hour, which is quite an escalation of sin, or be a Catholic priest, which is, in my mind, Jordan, forgive me for that, it was the worst thing you could imagine. And now here I am, like a priest and a bishop. And that just happened, by the way. I was elected in February, and my consecration was August 6th on Transfiguration. So major shifts in my life, far, 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 in some ways, removed from where I was as a kid. But for me, it feels integrated. So I'm sure the people I grew up with would consider me, the worst kind of apostate. But I feel very much at home. I don't think anything that was precious to me or good for me has been lost in that process. But it was a long journey for sure.
Thank you. Jordan, your turn.
Well, I'm just trying to find trying to find out right now whether I can access this video of Chris, and hey, kudos to you for getting out ahead of it so no one can use it as blackmail.
That's exactly my plan.
Yeah.
If I'm making a joke now, then no one can hold me over.
It's a real Augustine's confession thing. It's like I can actually tell you way more of the sins, if you're trying to find dirty laundry. Anyway, no, it's great. It's great to see. Thank you for inviting us, and it's good to see Chris. I grew up. The general pattern is similar, but the details are very different. I grew up in the Stone Campbell movement. My whole family is still very much a part of that movement. I'm the only one that isn't. And also, so those like include the Disciples of Christ, Churches of Christ, and then kind of in the middle. And we were in the middle branch. Mostly, it's just called This City Christian Church, whatever city Christian church. And so, very also totally decentralized, or as it were, hierarchically hidden, furtive hierarchies, but totally Bible focused, expository preaching all the time, no lectionary, low church. My childhood preacher was also a full-time farmer. His wife was the piano player and organist, right? I mean, so, and that was the they were the church. And actually, some of those, I have to say, some of those hymns to this day resonate in my mind. I love them, and I always hear it in their voice. And that's kind of generally. So I'm now, for a little over 8 years, I've been a Catholic. I became Catholic, about 8 years ago, Easter's ago. Dramatically different. I mean, like shift, from sort of the low church. Not very much attention to church history or the kind of, nothing like apostolic succession, none of that stuff. Sacraments, not really a thing. Although baptism and communion were, present every church service, or communion was, and then baptism was adult immersion. So, but very different, obviously, in the Catholic world now. George MacDonald, as I know we'll get to in a moment, but yeah, he sort of intervened as well. So again, similar to Chris, where it's like he's in the intervening. And what's funny is I don't think my engagement with George MacDonald would really fit that well with either side, whether where I began that context or where I am now. But I'll just end this portion by saying he is one of on a short list for me, who I can basically say, I think with full integrity, that I've had to depend on him directly to sustain anything like a maturing faith more than once, and the intervening and even now. So, but nevertheless, so that's my story from Stone Campbell movement, where I learned a lot of great stuff. I still have a lot of appreciation for my childhood background, especially the reverence for the text of Scripture, the knowing the original languages of Scripture, all the way up to now Catholic, and so it's trying to gain a greater appreciation of the broader and deeper tradition as well as the Scripture, and that's kind of where I'm at now.
Thanks, Jordan. I will just a brief reflection from both of you. I grew up in an independent fundamental Baptist environment. So same emphasis. Chris, your message on the KJV would still be well received there. And I often remarked, as I encountered Pentecostalism later in life, and then of course was a student of yours at Southeastern, Chris, I was fascinated by the similarities between the two threads, deeply similar, with that one notable difference in expression, which was forbidden. Any demonstrative movements were, criticized. And of course, Jordan and I connected over a love of Rich Mullins. So
yes,
yeah.
I should say I want to do a shout out real quick to my dad. Has always been an interesting and influential figure, and I'm sure father figures will come up in our discussion. He was raised in the Churches of Christ, non-instrumental, and it was a big deal in his family, like when he started just going to the Christian churches, like the other part of it. But he's also had his own really remarkable personal draw to the contemplative tradition, monastic tradition, and Rich Mullins and Brennan Manning were huge for my dad. And I remember that from childhood. Like we're listening to the Jesus album, and Rich Mullins going to a thing called CIY, which our churches went to, and he was doing worship and concerts. So yeah, that ragamuffin gospel sort of thing. I still consider that massively influential on me, and I like, with all seriousness.
Yeah, no, same. George and Rich are of a kindred spirit in my life, and that same sort of inflection point of the maturing and spiritual formation. All right, we got to jump into our next question. In your own words in life, as you've alluded to, how would you describe the voice of MacDonald? And is there any particular aspect of your relationship with God that has been uniquely fostered by MacDonald's perspective? You ready, Chris?
I'm ready. Yeah, I
Go
didn't
for
want to cut Jordan off, but yeah, yes, I've told this story, Derek. You've heard me tell it. Jordan probably has as well. I'm in Bible school. I take a class called Fantasy Fiction. We're reading C.S. Lewis, Tolkien, MacDonald, Dr. Seuss, and G.K. Chesterton, and a couple more. As often, I put off the readings until the night before. I sat down to read MacDonald's Lewis. I didn't like the edition of the book. It felt, I thought, this is going to be goofy. I didn't expect what was about to happen. I read the entire book at night in one setting, wept through the last half of it, probably, last third of it. And when I finished it, I knew, like, my life, I'm not going to be the same. I mean, I would say now, I knew then I would be a theologian. I knew not only that I'd be a theologian, but specifically which God it was I was going to be working with and for and toward. And I've never recovered from that. And I was utterly at sea in terms of how to describe what had happened or what it would mean for me. But I had no doubt that it had happened, whatever it was, and that I would be catching up to it from then on. And I think that's exactly what's played out. I still think I'm experiencing aftershocks all the time from that kind of original encounter. And for me, what I would say, there's that image of kind of the white hot heart, what I would call now the heart of Jesus, the sacred heart of Jesus. That's what I ran into, or what, singed me in that moment. I never recovered from. So I was 18, I think, at the time, maybe 19. I mean, it saved me, maybe is the right way to say it. It certainly altered the course of my life and altered not just what I was going to do, but how I was going to do it.
Beautiful. Thank you. Jordan?
Yeah. As I said, he's on the short list. So for me, there are probably about 4 authors that have sustained my spiritual life and my faith. Like, I would credit these 4 writers with why I'm even a Christian today in this world. He was the last to come. And for me, it was, I'm talking outside of the Bible, of course, but Origen of Alexandria was the first one for me. He was my introduction to the greater tradition. He was directly addressing questions that I had out of my experience at Bible college about scripture and how to find Christ in it. The next was Dostoevsky. I heard a rumor that Rowan Williams, former Archbishop of Canterbury, had just taken upon himself to read in his early 20s all of Dostoevsky's literature, and I really loved Williams, and I thought, well, I should do that too. So I decided to read all of Dostoevsky. I think I only have a handful of short stories left to go, but Dostoevsky did that to me, particularly the novel The Demons, or The Possessed. The other writer, it's not worth getting into the long and short of it, but basically was St. Anselm of Canterbury. And then the last one is MacDonald. So the question you posed was like, what aspect has sort of, I really think the question for me is which hasn't he affected? And it really gets at, I was just reviewing this morning one of my favorite essays, The Fantastic Imagination. He says in there directly, I love that text. I've always thought it's the perfect text to begin an intro to theology course with, because it gets to issues of morality, transcendence, language, interpretation. But he says in there directly, for my part, I don't write for children. I write for the childlike, be they 5 or 50 or 75. And that is about as good of a sort of summation of the spirit of MacDonald that I could muster, save the one you're going to read later by Chesterton, which is awesome. But that's what I experienced. I mean, I don't know. Yeah, I'm with you, Chris. Like, it's like, it's hard not to speak in the language of conversion or a Damascus Road sort of thing. It's I think the first I ever read of him was the fairy tales. And that was just because I was like, oh, well, I'm in theology, and it's kind of the cool, important thing to do to read fiction. And I think my first child was on the way. I've got 4 kids. And so, I couldn't believe it. After the very first fairy tale, I was like, okay, this isn't just, fairy tale. Like, this is the gospel over and over and over and over again. This is the plenitude of the divine Trinitarian life pouring forth. I mean, it's like a vision. It's like a Patmos type thing. John of Patmos I feel like that's everything that I read by him. Every single time I read George MacDonald, it doesn't even matter what the genre is. I'm always just blown away. I can't believe it. I can't believe it. So it's a cheap answer perhaps to give, but it's the only really trustworthy one, genuine one I can give, is that there really is no aspect of my theology that hasn't been influenced. And it really is, though, I think, traceable back to just Christ himself, that it's the Father of Jesus Christ is totally good. But really the only other way I can sum it up is 1 John 1. This is what we have heard and passed on to you, that God is light, and in him there is no darkness at all. I have to say, it was not until I read MacDonald that I first not only understood what that could possibly mean, but believed it. So I don't know how else to say it.
Well, I think the one thing you can be grateful for at this point is that we're not texting buddies, because I probably send a George MacDonald quote out to my friends twice a week. The interesting thing in my life is that when I first encountered his novels, I don't know if I was just spiritually immature or too high-minded. The prose was I couldn't be bothered with the prose, and so it was actually his unspoken sermons about 10 years ago that began me down this journey of, as you say, truly Damascus Road encounter.
Today's episode of The Plunge is sponsored by the word debonair. 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 It's an adjective which means confident, stylish, and charming. Why don't you be debonair today? Dress up a little bit better, just for fun. It's not like you have to dress formally all the time, but maybe once in a while, clean out the rough edges. Be debonair. Thank you, Debonair, for sponsoring this episode of The Plunge.
So last week, as you were just mentioning his essay on the imagination, our series discussed the baptized imagination with Carrie Dearborn. And if you haven't seen that book yet, it's a fantastic study that she has done. But before we dive into Lilith, I'd love to hear your thoughts generally on the importance of the imagination in our conception of God.
Goodness. I'm going to give a short answer and then unpack it a bit. I think the short answer is I don't think there is a separate thing called the imagination, like a faculty. There is something that we might label that. But I would that's just consciousness. There's just consciousness. There's just me being aware or being alive even. I think all of that is imagination. So what I want to resist at any cost is this difference between, I don't want imagination to be reduced to fancy or something I'm thinking up, something I'm creating from nothing, so to speak. And that's something neatly distinct from my experience of the real world. I don't buy that distinction. So with that said, the kind of longer answer is, I do think there's that wonderful line from Simone Weil about pure attention is prayer. And I do think that what we think of as imagination, far from making things up, is about learning to be fully aware of what is present to you, what is presenting itself, and what isn't presenting itself to you. And I think that's more or less identical with what Scripture calls faith, hope, and love. It's a way of learning to be present to God and the holy as they are present to you. And again, and or not, right? So this is where sometimes what we need is space. What we need is a kind of absence or distancing, and that is also grace. And imagination, then, cultivating what we call imagination, is about learning to be present to that reality. And maybe this is a little bit too glib, but I think we think of imagination as a peculiar faculty, right, that you use to escape reality. And I would say it's an all-pervasive capacity given by God that's built into what it means to be human. And that to live imaginatively is to live with faith and hope and love, to be aware of reality, and not just the reality of God and the saints and the angels and your neighbors, but the reality of the suffering around you, the reality of the suffering of the earth, as well as the suffering of your neighbors and so on. Like, it's another way of saying this is I think Jesus' life was fully imaginative. To quote MacDonald, right, nothing Jesus says is hyperbole. He doesn't speak in hyperbole. And this is the point. Like, he doesn't need to. For Jesus, everything is already fully realized because he's utterly imaginative. And it's, yeah, I could go forever about that. And I think that category, we have to remake it in the image of Jesus. We're going to go wrong every time.
That's so good, Chris. Honestly, that's the first time anyone has ever confronted that misconception so directly and clearly. So thank you. I will join you in bifurcating our existence and our imagination. Jordan?
Yeah, and that's just to give Chris a little high five here. Again, your question sent me back to that essay, Fantastic Imagination. And that's exactly the distinction that MacDonald makes there. He says fancy is mere invention, which is to say just randomness. But he wants to say imagination is something like the discerning of the deeper laws, which is both within you and in everything, which is just really honestly, which is to say the word of God in everything. And it's word, right? So it has to do with figuration, has to do with symbol, has to do with expression, form, but also with language. And I think that essay is just so crucial for this whole thing. He has another great line where he says, truth must always be adorned with beauty, and imagination is her tailor.
Yeah. I've read that essay, but I've forgotten that line. That's incredible.
It's one of my favorite. Yeah. Yeah. Another thing he says in there, Chris, just to sweeten the lure here, is he says almost exactly what you just said again, which he says, the one difference between our creation and God's, our language and God's, is that God can never mean more than he meant, and we always mean more than we ment.
That's underlined in my copy of the book. Yes, absolutely.
Yes. And what ties these together, I think, is that for him, imagination, I think he's in line with what Chris is saying. It isn't some separate faculty. It's definitely not an escapism type thing. What it is it's the resonance within and without of the deepest. It's the abyss cries to abyss. And because the word takes manifold forms, it also has the richness of plurality. He says how could what we say mean more than we meant, given all of the relations that every figure has to one another? And it's just kind of like almost Gerard Manley Hopkins sort of Christ plays in 10,000 places, lovely in eyes, lovely in limbs, not his. It's these sort of, it's like all of this, with Saint Maximus, a person that I love, saying that the word sort of goes out in ecstasy and plays in all creation. And so often, right, we get, especially even in the fairy tales, God depicted as a child, and one of them in particular, and he's each vision he's gradually growing younger, and it's just in the highest vision is a child playing, with, I don't know what it was, some game on the ground with these balls and stuff. And there's another theme just to highlight this. All I'm doing is really resonating with what Chris is saying. But there's another theme, and it's a Platonic theme, but it shows up all the time in MacDonald, and especially in the fairy tales again, of light coming out of someone's eyes, so that what they see is actually just as much from them as it is what's presented to them from without. In particular, I'm thinking of Cross Purposes, where the characters is with this other figure called Alice, and they're walking in this they can't see, it's like this cave, it's pitch black, but she starts to gradually grow up or grow a light and glow. And he at one point says, "You're so pale, Alice. I can see your face." She says, "How can you see me? It's pitch black here." And then the narrator kicks in and says, "In truth, what was happening was that he could see Alice clearer. She glowed as he grew in love for her." He says he could not see his own path, but seeing Alice thus was better than any path. And so this to me is a visual representation. It's a figure or a symbol of the imagination. It's not a faculty. It's not a separate faculty. It's the total harmonization of your interior, which then enables you to resonate with the truth of the exterior and their union together. And so that, in that way, kind of, it's at once co-creation you're participating in the creation that God himself is and does. So it's synergy, but it's also a kind of judgment, it's a sort of what is really true and what's not, severing away what's true, what's not. And so I think MacDonald, more than anything, he embodies that in his literature, in his fiction, and his writing. But I think that's how I would maybe start characterizing the imagination in a sort of MacDonald framework.
Yeah. Gosh, it's so helpful. Two thoughts really quickly. One is to Maximus and his reading of Gregory's point about Christ playing in various places, 10,000 places. Just today, last night actually, I think I posted on my Substack a letter from Nowen about written to someone named Dan and calling him to the heart of Jesus. And one of my friends, he posted a comment. His name is Dan, and he said, I imagined myself as Dan as if this were addressed to me. And, I'm deeply moved by it. I don't know what sense that makes. Well, again, it makes all the sense in the world. It's not like if we read Maximus and read Maximus's reading of Nazianzen and then, come to Hopkins and then to MacDonald, we can say there are no accidents in God. When we think imagination is, I'm fancying this connection, to use, MacDonald's distinction, that I'm fancying or inventing this connection because my name happens to be Dan and his name happens to be Dan.
Right.
That's imagination. No. Imagination is an awareness that nothing is accidental in God.
Mm-hmm.
Nothing is accidental in God. Like, this is what we're talking about when we say God is infinite and creative, that these are not happenstances that God is working with. They're not conditions to which God has to react. Right. They're already graced in ways we cannot imagine, like endlessly graced. And imagination is recognizing that, resonating with that, and responding to it. So anyway, I could go on forever about that. But I think to Jordan's point about childlike, Charles Peguy's Mystery of the Holy Innocents ends with, it's a kind of poem that's an attempting theology. How is it that the coming of Jesus leads to the death of children? And what does this do to Jesus? What does this do to us? And it ends with, in the heavenly courts, children are playing. Those same children are playing. Mm-hmm. That's the answer, right? And that seems to me to be that's an imaginative response to tragedy. The entire poem that then is holy because it brings us to that same image, the image of the child, which of course connects back to Proverbs and Maximus and Gregory's reading of, Christ as the child that's playing in the beginning. And that out of that play, the play of the word, all things come, right? Jordan, why don't you talk a little bit about what Maximus does with Gregory's reading of that? Because I don't think you can understand. I'm sorry I'm rushing so many thoughts together here, but I heard Milbank once at a conference say that George MacDonald is just the Cappadocians in 19th century English. That's what you're getting. You're getting a kind of Cappadocian vision of reality articulated in, the fantasy and the rhetoric of George MacDonald's world. And I think that's right. And I think this is another instance of that same point.
Yeah. A few things off of that. One real quick is that, again, in Fantastic Imagination, it's so fascinating to me that at the very beginning of it, MacDonald says, look, in terms of rules for creating literature, fantasy literature, the first rule you don't need to be beholden to any physical or natural law. You just have to be consistent once you adopt a world. So, you can't just be haphazard, then you destroy the story. But what's really interesting is there's one exception, and the one exception is the moral world. He says you cannot write a story and call evil the whole time what is in fact good, or vice versa. And this is, I think, really, really, and he also, by the way, has a habit of speaking about, he says in that same essay that words are living things in God's embodied thoughts. It's Maximus saying the word is the word, all words in all the cosmos. And what I think this helps us see, and we can get to Maximus' read of Gregory if you want in a minute, Chris, but it's, I think we also sometimes downplay what we might be called imagination, where it's when we characterize it as a sort of a projection or an escapism, it is in that sense, that kind of flattened sense that you rejected rightly earlier, Chris, of it's a sort of let's imagine a different world. What if things were differently? What if we could realize, and then the question is, well, is that realistic? And now we have to start making pragmatic calculations. That's totally not what MacDonald thinks. What I think he thinks is when you imagine something, as long as it's good, it's truly good, you're not creating it, you're discovering it. And even if all the phenomena in your life, all of our experiences, the brutality of finitude, nature at red in tooth and claw, tells you that's not real, that's not real. No, this is an abyss crying out to abyss because of God's work and presence throughout all creation. And I would say God's embodiment in all creation. You have actually hit upon something which is eternal, true, and has, as it were, you've sort of caught echoes of the one and only eternal word, which is always singing out. And that's actually more real than anything else we then call real or realistic or pragmatic. And this is why I think this is what inculcates in MacDonald this childlike spirit, which he says in his sermon, The Child in the Midst. He says we're to become the essence of child itself, which is certainty. Hey, I don't know. I'm thinking Hebrews 11:1 here, a sort of certainty and assurance of things in that, like faith, true faith.
Right.
And so that's in a way, in that from that perspective, imagination is but a function of true faith.
Yeah.
And this is what grounds your hope, and this is what enables you to love, which is what enables you to know the truth. Right in 1 Corinthians 13. I don't know how far we want to get off the rabbit trail with Maximus, but just that's
well, I will certainly be letting the students jump in to their heart's content, and I'll be also providing a glossary as Chris has referenced the Odyssey, Cappadocians, John Milbank, a lot of things that I'll have to explain, but I love it.
I'm just here to make your job easier, Derek. That's
you're nailing it. Do you get, while we're having a moment of levity, do you guys have 30 minutes? Is that let me know what your cutoff is. So we're going to jump into Lilith now. And really, I just included this because I wanted to read this quote from Chesterton. You all can respond, but this is my little soliloquy, so thank you for humoring me. Lilith is a fascinating story that, to my estimation, resonates with its own unique vitality, but also contains, from my perspective, hints of A Pilgrim's Progress, Gulliver's Travels, Alice in Wonderland. What's really interesting to me is MacDonald's work is at once metaphorical and allegorical, but also intensely literal, which I think maybe gets to your point, Chris, in terms of the imagination is not a separate thing, but particularly in his conclusive chapters, which explicitly portray that process of death and resurrection in ways and with characters that would cut decisively against the accepted thought of MacDonald's church and cultural ideas. The story seems to me to be simultaneously deeply subversive and yet intimately irresistible. As Lewis, and of course the title of this series is C.S. Lewis's Greatest Influence, drawing those who know Lewis in to understand his master, as he calls him, and Chesterton in particular point out these comparisons. There's a different dimension to MacDonald's work, and I just want to read this excerpt by Chesterton and appreciate your thoughts on what he's driving at and why MacDonald still matters perhaps more than ever today. And as a personal aside, before I read it, my intention is to pursue further studies on the work and life of MacDonald and to basically be a one-man band for MacDonald for the foreseeable future.
Good choice.
Thank you. So Chesterton writes, Dr. MacDonald enters fairyland like a citizen returning to his home. But though a genuine mystic and genuine Celt, he has not reappeared in the movement of Celtic mysticism which has taken place in our time, chiefly because of that singular idea which has taken possession of it, that is, the duty of a mystic to be melancholy. It will take them a century or two, perhaps, to realize the truth that Dr. MacDonald, I fancy, has always known, that melancholy is a frivolous thing compared with the seriousness of joy. Melancholy is negative and has to do with the trivialities like death. Joy is positive and has to answer for the renewal and perpetuation of being. Melancholy is irresponsible. It could watch the universe fall to pieces. Joy is responsible and upholds the universe in the void of space. This conception of the vigilance of the universal power fills all Dr. MacDonald's novels with the unfathomable gravity of complete happiness, the gravity of a child at play. A curious glow pervades his books. The flowers seem like colored flames broken loose from the flaming heart of the world. Every bush of gorse is a burning bush. burning for the same cause as that of Moses. This sense of a perfect secret, almost painfully kept by the universe, is what shames the weariness of modern mystics, as if anyone who knew a secret could be weary. And scene.
Chris, go.
Gosh, I love it. I love it. I mean, Chesterton can be a little much, but man, when you get a little much on something that good, it's perfect.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's like that's Chesterton at his best, I think, right there. And absolutely right. That distinction between the serious business of joy, right, and the triviality of so much melancholy. It reminds me, I was at a conference years and years ago, and was a part of the emergent church movement at the time, and so much talk about the ways in which we fail to grieve, and the emphasis was lament. And there was, I don't know who he was, one of the attendees stood up and said, this feels like a spirituality that's always Lent and never Christmas. And I was like, yes, that's exactly what it is, right? And I think so many of us, we end up living there, whether we intend to or not, right? We end up living in places in which back to what we think is real, it feels, that comment about the triviality of death, right? We tend to think melancholy is the only realistic way to orient yourself to reality, some version of it. And gosh, nothing could be further from the truth. And it's because MacDonald is alive and aware that he knows better than that, right? He knows that the depths of suffering open out on the depths of a deeper joy. God is always deeper. Love is always deepest. As I think those are his exact words, right? Love is deepest, and all that love has loved into reality. And so if you go more deeply in, this is what separates MacDonald from so much kind of new agey pop Christian universalism, etc. It's not a glancing off the surface of the brokenness of the world. It's a penetration through it into the love that is deepest. It's not a dismissal of injustice or cruelty, the gone wrongness of things, to use Francis Young's phrase. It's to say, absolutely, things have gone much further wrong than we've ever admitted. But go deeper in, and what you find is something that cannot go wrong, but will redeem even this, right? The heart of Jesus, and the heart of Jesus that opens out on the infinite life of God. So I think that's why joy springs up, right? Like if you penetrate through all of that, what you hit is a geyser of life, a well of life, and it springs up in joy.
Wow, that's great. Jordan?
Yeah. So what strikes me about the Chesterton quote is that the way he just characterized MacDonald is exactly the way he ends his book Orthodoxy, when he's characterizing the thing that Jesus kept hidden, his mirth. And there's two things about that. I'm no Chesterton scholar or anything, and I've only really read a handful of things by him, just to confess. Two things that are great about that is that then when he turns to MacDonald, it's like he's already seeing in MacDonald the very thing that he's expecting from Christ. So to rub it back a little bit to the earlier point about imagination, MacDonald's very act of depicting, like say in Lilith, writing Lilith is a participation in the mirth of God breaking forth into the tears of this world. So that's one point. I like that sort of emphasis on creativity, human creativity, the imagination. The other one, though, is I was also just paging through yesterday a book by David Hart, one of his first ones, Beauty of the Infinite. He's got a really nice section at the end called, I'm going to miss it, something of tragedy and the terrors of resurrection. And it's the section in that book where he basically rejects these sort of theologies of tragedy. And it's exactly the same kind of spirit, right, that Chesterton's diagnosing with the modern mystics, as if melancholy is more serious than anything else. Well, that's a judgment. And the judgment is this: the world that you experience now is it. This is as good as it gets. And what I love about MacDonald is and this is the point that, Chris, I think you were hitting on too, joy is serious because it's a judgment. And it's not just a judgment on this world. It's a judgment on God. Because the presumption, again, a childlike presumption, which therefore is not a sin. It's not a rebellion. But it is a kind of outlandishness, an extravagant presumption. the kind that, my kids sometimes have when they think I know everything and they're asking me all these questions and they're like, Dad, don't you know, like, what about, how many stars are there? And I'm like, oh my goodness, let me Google that, but it's like, but it's kind of flattering, right? Like they think you know everything. They'll ask you about anything, like, surely Dad. And I'm like, well, I did get I did study theology, which, certainly doesn't help in their questions. But but the presumption is this: even in the face of the trivialities, things like death, I can be joyful, not because I'm ignoring the seriousness of death, but because I am so confident in God's goodness and his ability to bring about his will always and in all things, and through it, in other words, his ability to resurrect even from death, his ability to harrow hell, that I don't need to let what is an initial tragedy become the ultimate horizon of reality. The ultimate horizon is Christ crucified and resurrected. He's the wisdom, right, and power of God for us. And so if anything is less than that in comparison with Christ, it isn't serious. And so that kind of, I think it's a great depiction. It's a great characterization of MacDonald, because one thing I do sometimes not like about more maybe popular level discussions and treatments of MacDonald in some quarters, not in all, is a kind of like, he's relegated to like devotional literature, but a devotional sort of genre, which is like, pithy quotes and sort of like lift up your spirits every day. And now, hey, I say read them every day. Definitely do that. And there's a deeper sense of devotional that could come out. But it's almost like, George is a great guy. He just sort of never quite grew up.
Right.
It's like, but then you learn anything about his life and you're like, no, this guy went through it more than most of us, right? Poverty throughout his whole life, children, someone dying. And so all that to say is he's so bewitching in his confidence in God's goodness. You can sort of start to suspect, I think wrongly, he might not quite see the world in reality. But the truth is he sees the true reality more than most of us do. And so he looks to us like maybe sometimes like a sort of childish, but he's not childish. He's divinely childlike.
It truly is. Thank you so much. I appreciate this so much. I'm personally just enamored, and really appreciate that last point, Jordan, how often MacDonald is relegated to a simpleton or less a sophisticated thinker. And yet, as you say, and as Chris said, he pierces through all of it to the true substance of life and the universe. So we're going to just do a rapid fire, so to speak, even though there's nothing you can do rapidly with MacDonald if you're going to be serious, but seriously joyful. And I'm just going to read a quote from Lilith, and you guys just give me your take on it. First one is, annihilation itself is no death to evil. Only good where evil was is evil dead. An evil thing must live with its evil until it chooses to be good. That alone is the slaying of evil.
Absolutely right. This is Gregory of Nyssa. It's Paul. It's the cry of the Psalms, but it is absolutely right. If that's not true, we're all in serious trouble. Absolutely right.
Perfect. And
yeah.
And sorry, I was just going to say, and Paul read rightly, if I may be so bold.
I like to assume that Paul knew what he was saying. The problem is with us,
Yes.
No, I also just want to say, like, this is the passages you picked are awesome. They're exactly the right ones. And this is one, what a thing to believe. What is he like? Let's put some actual, what was the exact quote, Derek? I bring it up. Only, where evil was. What was it?
Where evil was is evil dead.
So I love the tense there, evil was, because isn't saying as long as something good comes out of evil, we're cool with the evil.
Right.
It's not, well, at least we got a greater end, a greater good. It is almost, I want to say, I'm trying to be like, it is again, I'll just say outlandish and extravagant and really childlike conviction that just because, say, tragedies happened in the past, we say that past is past. It's over, done and over, as if it's fixed or emblazoned like on a frieze. And that God himself is going to have to gaze upon the monuments of tragedies throughout all eternity, even if he manages to get most or every creature into heaven. But these things will stand as memorials in memory, eternal memory. No. For MacDonald, it's only good where evil was, which means in the very wasness of whatever tragedy or evil comes about, God will find a way. It's back to the fantastic imagination. There is no law greater than morality and love. And so if God has to bend the very laws of time as we perceive them, that by God is what he will do. There is no other law. There's nothing else. The only thing that God is after or cares about or maintains in its integrity is converting us. There's nothing else. He's making us children. He's making us participants, maybe even more, depending on who you're reading. And that's so this, that's just what I get at is that this passage isn't just saying, hey, God is going to sort of, it'll all work out good in the end, like the way we wrongly read Romans 8, as you guys mentioned, right? It's saying also the same thing he says in his sermon, justice, which is there is no substitute. True justice is absolute restoration. God forbid if something ever happens to my child or something like that, and the person who caused it, intentionally or not, is brought to trial, convicted, given the penalty to the full extent of the law, and spends their life in prison. Guess what? I'm not satisfied. Why is that? Because nothing less than my dead and gone and absent child is a replacement for that child. I'm going to say one more thing, because you see how excited I get with this. With MacDonald, this is what he does. Imagine me in the house when I'm reading him. I'm screaming and throwing stuff. But this is why I think, look, this is the kind of spirit that's going to be winsome and attractive for Christian faith in this world today. I talk to so many people that are indifferent towards death. And it's usually young people, and for understandable reasons. I used to teach college as well, undergrad. We had seminars, and it was always interesting. It's like, man, all this kind of heaviness, this tragedies we're reading, the classics and so on, like, and they didn't like talking about it. And at one point, I just said, like, look, I'm going to say something. If resurrection isn't true, then I don't think anything matters, and nothing and nothing has value at all. And in fact, the relationships I have with my kids are nothing but torture. Because you're tantalizing me with a beautiful relationship, and then you will rip it away at my death or theirs or both, never to be restored. Only good where evil was is enough. Anything less is we may as well make tragedy itself our God, because that's what wins at the end of the day.
We should do several hours just on this point. I mean, I think for many of us, what we're hoping for and what we are afraid even to hope for is that God will be able to make some good from what's gone wrong.
Right.
What's promised is not that God will make good from what's gone wrong, not even some good or all good, but that God will make right what went wrong. Because there's no good that can come from any evil that makes that evil worth it. If it did, it would mean the evil is good.
Yes, and necessary.
And therefore, the God of the gospel is not true. The only way the God of the gospel is who he says he is for every wrong to be made right in a way that is good for everyone involved. Right. And so, this is Ivan and Dostoevsky with rightly refuses, for the wrong reasons, but rightly refuses any kind of quote unquote higher harmony, any way in which God uses evil to bring about good things. No. I think that is right. Good does not happen after evil. Good happens to evil in such a way that it makes right what went wrong and sets right everything that has gone wrong. Evil was, good is.
Yeah.
And of course, as we'll get to, MacDonald simultaneously holds, of course, process. Everyone needs to go through process. I mean, we're going to get there. In fact, whatever the process needs to be, the absolute lengths of the process will be carried out. So in that sense, he's working with us. He's accommodating us. He's accompanying us. He's children. And we all know what that's like and how accommodating you have to be and how long things take to, right? But exactly what Chris just said, that we can never lose our eye on the ball there. MacDonald never does. And this quote shows that perfectly. It's yes, the process. And the process might be messy. In fact, it might even involve grave errors and terrible things that happen along the way. But somehow the culmination and perfection of the process will be, in fact, the rectification of things that happen in the process that ought not to have. That is amazing because it's weird and mind-bending. But Chris is right. We often treat God as if he does the best he can with what he's got. He gets one pass through this creation thing. Yeah. And, he's going to try to fumble it around And he'll get, like you said, some good out of it, at least in the end. And, maybe more than any of us could ever imagine. At the end, his hands are still sort of tied, like, oh, guys, that's my best performance. That's the best I got. And it's like, no, that's the first pass is not, just because it passed doesn't mean it's passed.
Yeah.
The first pass is literally, this is, as Maximus says, just to go back there, this life is a womb. We're not yet even fully born.
Mm-hmm.
The first pass is our gestation, but we're on our way to becoming actually real. Whatever processes down to the individual path that every person, it's a huge theme in MacDonald, every person's individual path, which leads to the same God and the same salvation, the same Christ in the end. That will be all played out, but still at the end, the culmination here is only good where evil was. There's nothing less than that.
Yeah. Well, golly. Yeah, you're right, Chris, several hours alone. But as is often the case with sermons or homilies, the last point is going to be scurried through. I just want to hit the last quote because it's so powerful. It's such an all-encompassing vision of restoration as MacDonald shifts from sort of fancy, as which I now know there's no separation, but to the literal personage of Adam and Eve who are desperate to restore Lilith, Adam's first wife, and there's a lot of mythology around that. But I'm just going to read this quote. Adam is talking to the main character about Lilith, and he says, "She is far away from us, afar in the hell of her self-consciousness. The central fire of the universe is radiating into her the knowledge of good and evil, the knowledge of what she is. She knows that she is herself the fire in which she is burning, but she does not know that the light of life is the heart of that fire. Her torment is that she is what she is. Do not fear for her, she is not forsaken. No gentler way to help her was left. Wait and watch." Go ahead, Jordan.
Well, it's just, I'll never get used to these lines, you run into them, you've read them a million times, it's just like, so good. So what's so fascinating there is, and a quote we skipped over, kind of plays off this well, that, there's a light that goes deeper than your will. One of the big themes in that judgment scene at the end of Lilith is that all of our sin happens. This is an old idea. Talk about Gregory of Nyssa, right, Chris? All of our sin happens under the veil of a deep ignorance, a deep error, a misjudgment. Notice that it says there the knowledge of good and evil. Well, what's that? Well, that's the tree from Genesis 3. That Adam and Eve and the entirety of the human race is already sort of mistaking. And she doesn't know that the light that she suffers is also the light, that burning white hot, at the heart of the universe. That is the love of God, the consuming fire. And that is what she will come to know. That's the process of judgment. That's the eschatological judgment, is a process of us coming to see that what we take, again, in the immediate appearances as suffering, as torture, and it is torturous and it is suffering, is always, to use an old patristic idea, like a scalpel, the scalpel of a surgeon applied, it does hurt, and especially before they had anesthesia. It hurts, but it's in order to heal something fundamental and deep. And something so fundamental and deep as self-deception, which Lilith perfectly embodies. She thinks she's the master over her own will. She thinks she knows where she is, what her place is in this world. She thinks she knows the God that she rejected. She knows nothing of any of that. And then I have this sort of idea. I know this is sort of outside of the, how in Lilith, she's always grasping. And part of it is cutting off her arm, right? She has to open her hand. And I know there's a part in the story that has indicates maybe a different interpretation, but I always read that. When I first read that, I thought probably what's in her hand that she's grasping isn't anything.
Mm-hmm.
It's just a grasping at illusion. It's totally ignorant, right? And so this, for me, we too often think of judgment, God's judgment, as like this great courtroom scene that's going to happen at the end of time. And God is, and of course, we've got images of that, but we basically take that at face value. And we're like, oh yeah, okay, we're going to each walk up, have the case read against us. Which way are you going to go? That's the verdict. It's over. That's not real judgment. That's not spiritual judgment, because spiritual judgment is always God's work of creation at the same time. And God hasn't just created a world of great matrices and numbers and orders. He's created a world of people and faces and children. And he's got to find a way to perfect all of them through them, with them. And that's the process of true spiritual joy. That's the process that really in the Christian life now we should already have undertaken. When I pray, when I fast, when I go to church, when I read the Bible, whatever it is you're doing, you're already you're participating in your own judgment, which is for your healing, your salvation, in other words. So this is, to me, a lot of that kind of like, God will do anything to get to anyone. There's no other law. Remember, there's no other law than the law of love. Secondly, it could take forever, and it's going to be as unique as each person is to them. But then thirdly, right, back to the only good, where evil was. Well, when I sin, make myself false. And so my true self needs to be where my false selves that I generate are always, trying to take its place. And until that happens, God's work, his creation with me, he who began a good work in you will bring it to completion. Well, the completion is going to be nothing less than my final creation, my perfection, my actual birth. And I think that's some of what's getting communicated there in this part of the novel.
Really good. Thank you. Chris?
I think what distorts us, and this, of course, is the effect of sin, like the warping effect that sin has on our imagination, as that awareness that we should have as human beings, is that God is conditioned by this or that law that he has to answer to, or he's limited by our readiness and willingness to let him be God. For another purpose, I was working back through the catechism of the church I grew up in. I think it was written first in the 50s and then got republished lots of times every 4 years or so. And I want to read just a line from it and then point to how MacDonald sees past this, right? So it's the section on redemption. And here are some of the Q&As. Does God love all men? Yes. How could God love man after he had sinned? Because love is one of God's moral attributes. What was the plan of redemption? Or when was the plan of redemption formed? So notice we're talking about God loving us, and then we shift to this language of plan suddenly. God loves us. God has always loved us. We go wrong. God needs a plan. Right? And then later, just to make the point explicit, it asks outright, was God's love sufficient to save man? No. His love is the source of redemption, but not the means of salvation. Why was God's love not sufficient? Because God is not only love, but holy, righteous, and just. Where God loves us, but that's not enough. But he's also holy, just, and righteous, and those things are by definition in this scheme, which is the same scheme, of course, that MacDonald is reacting against, just a kind of watered-down version of that Calvinism that he's reacting against. It's insisting that God's holiness is a limit on his love, that God's holiness is a condition in God that keeps him from loving us the way he wants to. So this is a God who's internally conflicted between what is right and what is good, between what is true and what is beautiful, between what he wants and what is actually possible for him to do for us. And of course, right there, we should know we've gone terribly, terribly, terribly wrong, right? But we don't know it because we are assuming that there are conditions either internal or external to God that make his love insufficient, that make his love tragic, to go back to the point George.
Yes.
That make it so that him loving us is the source of incredible pain. There's this Gregory of Nyssa again, talking about how in this life, given what death and finitude do to us, of course love is tragic. And the better your love is, the more tragic it is, because you will lose it. And of course, Dante, this is precisely what he gets at with lovers whose love keeps them from being open to the love of God because they're clinging to it out of that sense of the tragic, right? But then the section ends with this. Will everybody be saved since Christ died for all? And this is the answer. The atonement that's given, the atonement of Christ only made possible the salvation of everyone. It is therefore necessary to accept this provision. So even when, and of course, these folks, unlike the Calvinists that MacDonald reacting against, are saying Christ died for all. He wants to save all. But it actually drives the tragedy up to this unbearable degree, because now God wants to save everyone. It's not like in the Calvinism MacDonald is rejecting, which is God does not want to save everybody. That's why he doesn't. No, he wants to. He desperately wants to, but he cannot. He cannot do it. And he cannot do it because we won't let him. And the plan isn't capable of bringing that about. And how people don't realize right at that point, okay, one, you've got an internally conflicted God. You've got a story that's inherently a story of tragedy. You've got creatures who've been made with infinite responsibility, but without infinite resources for fulfilling that responsibility in and of themselves. And you've got a God who makes a plan that doesn't work. So like across the board, it's disastrous. And what's genius about MacDonald, and what I think makes it so that it is like reading him is like having a Patmos experience, is he sees past the smoke of all that. Yeah. He recognizes right away, nope, it's not like that. It's absolutely not like that. God's love and God's holiness are not opposed spectra on a spectrum, right? They're not at odds with each other. God's not unwise. If he makes a plan, he knows what he's doing, right? And it's simple, like not simplistic by any means, but it is simple. And it comes down to God is good. God will do anything and everything necessary for us to be good in the way that God is good. And to quote, Benjamin Fondon, the most important revelation of Jesus in his teaching is the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. Everything else, and this is the point Jordan made earlier, everything God does, he does for our good, so that we can be children like he is a child. And it's all working to that end. And I think that's simple in that childlike way, but we lose that simplicity. And in our, whether it's, the kind of low church theological frame that I'm referencing here, or the architectures of the Calvinism that MacDonald was rejecting, or whatever other tradition, they mislead us into imagining that God is unable to do what is clearly in God's heart to do.
And isn't that remarkable, Chris, that like even as he rejects and resists the Calvinism he was brought up in, he does hold on to something that's crucial about it, that's true about it. Because, under the scenario that God sort of wishes to save all or has this plan, but just can't, he needs us to provide the means because his love isn't sufficient. Well, then, yeah, like you said, not only is sort of the monuments of tragedy before God all eternity, but it goes up like God himself can't even be the God he wanted to be. He can't even be the God he wanted Absolutely. To be. And that it's kind of remarkable that MacDonald still holds on to that, quote unquote Calvinist sort of, I think it's more like just Augustinian idea of well, no, that can't be right. So the question can't be that God's ultimate identity, his actuality, depends absolutely on us. That part I'm going to retain. I'm just going to switch out the content and say that he's not fundamentally indifferent to us as long as he sort of, just elects from who's going to be saved, who's not. His plan from eternity is that his plan is nothing less than who Jesus Christ is, which is crucified love, effecting the resurrection of all.
Yes. And this is a side note, and you can edit this out, Derek. But that's why if we ever talk about any of the attributes of God without recognizing that that's a way of naming Jesus, we've gone wrong. If we talk about the plan and we mean something other than the life of Jesus of Nazareth, we've gone wrong, right? And we've set ourselves up for these kinds of dead ends that aren't just theological dead ends. The pastoral consequences of teaching people to imagine that God's life is internally conflicted just like theirs is, and that God is powerless to be the God he wants to be, just like they're powerless to be the person they want to be. The damage that does to our deep souls. And I think this is something I heard David Hart say once about all the controversy around what he says about hell. He says, as children, when our hearts are still pure, we know that this can't be right, but we then get diseased and fractured by what must be true, and we end up being alienated from ourselves. And I think this is another thing MacDonald knows. The deep heart can be deceived, but it does not lie. It cannot lie. Not even capable of it. It can be deceived if it's disoriented or misled, but it cannot lie to you. And the child knows this. The adult forgets it. Part of what MacDonald is doing is trusting what his heart says to him when his heart is turned to the heart of Jesus. And that's, I think, that's why it sears us the way it does. It burns us the way it does, because it's true in a way you can't deny once you've encountered it, because your heart, once it's saved from that deception, once it's kind of brought back to the heart of Jesus, then your heart tells you what it's been trying to tell you all along. And if you listen to it, like, absolutely, like, I don't know what all it means, but this is so, like, this has to be so.
I just have to fix one quick anecdote from his novel, Robert Falconer. There's an excellent illustration of what you just said, Chris. Robert Falconer is the main character. He's a young boy. He's raised by his grandma, who's a staunch Calvinist. His dad is wayward, went off, basically abandoned him. So at one point, Robert's with his grandmother praying for basically the salvation of his father, whom he barely knows but wants to know and wishes he was present. He's not. And he prays. He says, "God, we must have my father back with us." And his grandmother stops him in the middle of the prayer and says, "Say, if it is your will."
Mm.
And Robert says, "No, I can't." And he says, "No, it's that child, like the child that knows, right? That can't be lied to." He says, "No, we must have him back." The must, the necessity. It's not it's not an impersonal blind necessity. It's the necessity of love. It's Romans 13:10. The debts of love. Owe no man any debt except the debt of love. There is a necessity and an obligation which transcends our normal idea of obligations in love. And that's what the child knows. It's like, "No, I love you. You're good. I know you make mistakes. I know you yelled at me. I know you're impatient, but I forgive you. I love you. I must have you." Like, talk about Lex Orandi, Lex Orandi. The law of prayer is the law of belief. There you have it right there. It's the child knows better than the highfalutin theologian.
Yes.
That's right.
Because they cannot in that moment be deluded.
Yeah.
They hear it purely, the word of God in them.
Yeah, sorry, I'm not trying to jump in.
No. Wait, this is what MacDonald does to us, right? We're just
This is why what we've heard in the Gethsemane prayer, and this will again connect MacDonald to Maximus. What we've heard in the Gethsemane prayer, when Jesus says, "If it be your will, let this cup pass from me," what we've heard is conditionality to which Jesus and the Father must.
Yeah.
What I've started saying is, what we should hear there is, "As it is your will." There's a recognition at one level that this is not right.
Right.
Death is not right. And this is why Jesus is rightly afraid. Because death should not be. And he knows it should not be. But what Jesus is yielded to, so in the language of Hebrews about Jesus submitting to God with these loud cries, crying out to be delivered from death. And he's heard, we're told, because of his loud cries. What Jesus is doing there is accepting how God's will bring about the good he knows must come. That's where the struggle is. So the prayer is, "My Father must come back to me as it is your will, God." Meaning it's going to come in a way I can't imagine, and that in the short run is going to be like hell.
Yes.
But I know the good must come. And this is another thing MacDonald recognizes. That line about if he talks about Jesus' statement, "If you being evil know how to give good things, how much more?" And MacDonald said, there's no way that God the Father is less good than a good father that I know.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
I cannot be, right? So if a good father that I know would never do these things, then there's no way that the infinitely good father would ever do things of that kind, right? Obviously, I think this is, again, the point here as well, right? We so easily get sidetracked into things that are clearly untrue. We get clouded and confused, but we have to keep coming back to, no, this is true. We know it's true. What we can't know is how God's going to bring that about. That's where the yieldedness comes in. That's where the submission is required.
And we can't know how, because as he says in Fantasies, the only way back home is through yourself. It's not some new agey, like, sort of be who you are. It's your path to the destination is the perfection of you.
That's right.
You becoming a full child of God, which Christ gave us the power to do, according to John 1. So how could that be templated? How could that just be a generic pattern? God doesn't make generic patterns.
Right.
He makes you and you and you and you. So anyhow, that's the process of judgment too. And Lilith itself, and Lilith herself, as that quote just said, it's her own self-consciousness that's burning, and it will, as long as it takes for her.
That's right. Thank you so much, man. I'm so blessed, and I know that all of the attendees will be as well. And I wish we had many more hours. And I've always thought, the fact that our schedules are always too full is an indication that the human heart knows we're destined for eternity. But do you have any parting thoughts about Lilith in particular, or George MacDonald generally, before we conclude?
Go ahead, Chris.
Oh, goodness. I think, one of the things that haunts me about it, maybe then this is an odd place to end, so you should just not include this, Derek, but I will say one thing that haunts me about it is the effect that C.S. Lewis has had. Like, he has much further reach than MacDonald.
Yes.
And Lewis says outright, that it's MacDonald to which he owes his conversion, just like I do. And he says that I've never read anyone who's so close to the Spirit of Christ. But then Lewis departs from MacDonald on so many points over and over again. Lewis's vision of God in the end is a tragic one. The great divorce is what he imagines as the end of all things. The great separation, the tragedy. I mean, in Problem of Pain, Lewis says that God loses. Like, that's the story. God loses. The door to hell is locked on the inside, and God is knocking at the door, the jilted lover or the parent who can't get to the child that's dying in the house. And part of what haunts me about it is that Lewis read MacDonald. He produced an anthology of his works, writes an introduction about him, praises him again as the most Christ-like. I think he says that the writer most consistently near to the Spirit of Christ or something. And yet it doesn't convince him. That's one thing which is haunting. Another thing is, and Lewis is the one that has the loudest voice in the room for evangelicals. And that troubles me. That troubles me.
Me too, Chris. And sorry, I was just going to say that, it was no accident that we titled this series C.S. Lewis's Greatest Influence. And if I may, Chris, I heard you in a recent conversation say perhaps the greatest thing Lewis did was point to MacDonald. So
I'm not being, I really do think.
No,
I agree.
Right. That may be, in the long run, looking at what Lewis is, why does he have the popularity he has? What is God doing with the popularity he has? Mm-hmm. It's Lewis bearing witness to MacDonald, I think.
That's actually a wonderful place to end, I think, because I think a few things that strike me about that. One is that it makes me go back to the Chesterton quote that Derek read. Maybe it's in 100 years or two. It's almost like Lewis didn't quite get the seriousness of the joy. The other thing, though, is that like the bigger point you're making, Chris, right? Why evangelicals so much more interested in Lewis? Like that, it's not just that they're like kind of interested in both, but a little bit more in Lewis. The proportions are wild, right? I mean, that's the first book I really read as a 16-year-old, Mere Christianity. And I think it's because we take sort of the triumph of conquering, just pure simplistic, like we love Lewis's story. He was converted. I don't get that. And I don't have the story. Like MacDonald, in some way, he was a child. It's almost like he was born childlike and he never forfeited it. And that's not for us. I want the giant intellectual public conversion and then becomes the sort of champion. And I'm not trying to reduce Lewis to that. And I think he's endlessly fascinating as well. But I think like we love the apologist who can beat back the waves of secular invasion or sort of chipping away at our foundations. And it sort of says something about us, talk about the light within us and whether or not we can see the truth exterior outside of us, that we're more in with that. It's more compelling to us than somebody who's just a consistent, perpetual, utterly beautiful and fascinating childlike soul. And so my last word is this. I'd want to say to people listening, and perhaps this is another reason why, look, his prose are strange sometimes. He's Scottish, he's got that different background. He's not writing mid-20th century beautiful English prose like Lewis is. So, okay, I've handed MacDonald to a few people, and they're kind of like, man, it's kind of tough to read. So, look, it's going to take some getting used to. If that bothers you, start with the fairy tales, but stick in it. And if you read Lewis especially, it's like reading Dostoevsky's Brothers Karamazov. Like the first 50 pages is a genealogy. Okay, that's boring, but stick with it. The prose I think actually are beautiful, more beautiful than Lewis gave credit, but they are different for us moderns or 21st century English readers. And so stick with it. Start with the fairy tales. and don't chase after the kind of fireworks, because the sort of beating heart, the white heart center of the universe that Lilith is experiencing, it ends up being, I think, far more long lasting for sustaining one's spirit and faith, if I can be that bold without making any other generalizations.
Thank you, man. Perfect. Thank you both so much.
Dr. Jordan Daniel Wood is a theologian and associate professor of theology and biblical studies at Belmont University in Nashville, Tennessee. His most recent book, The Whole Mystery of Christ, Creation as Incarnation in Maximus Confessor,